Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. In this video, I will be covering chapters 5 through 8 of the book. So let's get started with chapter 5. As you will recall from our first video, this is an epistolary novel. The chapters are each letters written by the demon Screwtape to his nephew, the demon Wormwood. And this letter that comprises chapter 5 begins with Screwtape's reaction to the beginning of World War II. Remember that this was first published in 1942, so Lewis was writing in the actual context of the Second World War as it was happening. And Screwtape is actually annoyed with Wormwood for devoting his last letter to celebrating the onset of the war instead of providing Screwtape with the expected summary of his work with the patient. Screwtape observes that the anguish and bewilderment of the patient, and the patient, again, just to remind you, is the subject that Wormwood is trying to turn away from God and toward their side, toward Satan. The patient is anguished and bewildered at the onset of the outbreak of the Second World War. And Screwtape worries that this has gone to Wormwood's head. He says, quote, "Did the patient respond to some of your terror pictures of the future? Did you work in some good self-pitying glances at the happy past? Some fine thrills in the pit of his stomach, were there? You played your violin prettily, did you? Well, it's all very natural. But do remember, Wormwood, that duty comes before pleasure." Screwtape warns Wormwood to remember the real business of undermining faith and preventing the foundation of virtues. While the war is entertaining, it only ultimately does them good if they can use it to draw people to their side, which doesn't happen automatically. Screwtape tells Wormwood that the enemy, which is God, uses the glimpses of misery brought about by war to tantalize and torment demons like themselves who starve for human misery. Screwtape urges Wormwood to think about how they can use the war, because there are elements of it which could work against them. War can cause people to turn to God rather than away from him. War can compel people to invest in things beyond themselves, to commit themselves to higher values. And in war, people can pledge themselves to God and then be killed shortly thereafter, in which cases their souls would belong to the enemy party, as Screwtape puts it. So it's much better for people to grow old and to die sick and bitter and surrounded by doctors and friends they mistrust than to pledge themselves to God and then run off and get killed right away in battle. Screwtape ends the chapter by once again warning Wormwood that the opportunity presented to them by the war is, in his view, exaggerated. After all, the patient could just as easily turn to God in a moment of pain and fear, and in such a case, winning him away from the enemy would be very difficult. Well, first I want to make a comment on the writing of this chapter, because this was my favorite chapter of the book so far, because it's at this point that the character of Screwtape and the satirical voice of Lewis, the author, are really starting to come through. I'm enjoying the picture being painted here of Screwtape as the older, more experienced, and more cynical demon, while Wormwood, who is also a demon dedicated to securing the damnation of human souls, comes across as comparatively naive and idealistic. And of course, because of the conceit of the book, we don't actually get to read Wormwood's letters. We can only infer things about Wormwood from Screwtape. So we're seeing him through Screwtape's eyes as well. As a lover of dark comedy, which I am, I liked Screwtape scolding Wormwood about his excitement regarding the war. I thought that was funny. "Oh, of course, you kids think this war is going to fix everything. The souls are just going to damn themselves. Where there's still real work to be done, you whippersnapper." I just think that's very funny. But of course, it's not just Lewis the satirist at work in this chapter. Lewis the apologist checks in as well. He uses Screwtape's advice to Wormwood as a device to remind his readers that the fear and pain and hopelessness of war are temporary, that suffering is a part of God's plan for salvation, and that for all its horrors, war can also remind us of what's truly important and push us to not only turn toward God, but also turn toward each other. And these are all very nice thoughts, and hopefully they were of some comfort to some of the folks who read them during World War II. And Lewis was commended during the war and after the war for his radio broadcasts, bringing purpose and meaning and comfort to Britons during the war. But these things that Lewis tells us in this text are also bromides. And more than anything, they reveal how privileged C.S. Lewis was when he wrote this book. It's all very well to tell people that war is bad, but it's not the end of the world if you have every expectation of surviving it and of not having to fight in it yourself. Now, I should mention, just so I don't come off as too dismissive of Lewis, that C.S. Lewis did serve in the First World War. He was sent to the front and was wounded in 1918, and that he offered to re-enlist as an instructor during the Second World War, but the Army declined. And also during the Second World War, he took people into his home, people who had been displaced by the war, people whose homes had been destroyed in bombings and things like that. So he was not just the out-of-touch aristocrat patting the common folk on the head and telling them, now, don't get all worked up about this little war. It's not the end of the world. But at the same time, when war broke out in Europe, he was a scholar at Oxford. He was becoming known as a writer. He was not yet the worldwide sensation that he would be several years after this when he first started publishing the Narnia series. But he was becoming known as a writer. And soon enough, he would be on the radio talking to people all over Britain. So he was in a much safer position than most other people who faced the very real prospect of having to fight and possibly die in the war, or of having their homes or their communities bombed to rubble during the early years of the war when Germany was carrying out the Blitz in England. So I don't want to downplay Lewis's credentials as someone who has something to say about the nature of war, but at the same time, by the time the Second World War rolled around, it was very easy for him to say, oh, the war is bad, but don't worry about it, it's not the end of the world. It's also interesting that Lewis makes the argument in this chapter that war, a cause of such misery and destruction, is not necessarily of the devil. Screwtape repeatedly warns Wormwood not to count his chickens before they hatch, so to speak, because God can use war to win people to his side just as easily as they, the demons, can. So, just a reminder, in case you forgot, that the God of Christianity not only allows war, and in fact has commanded wars according to the Bible, and also according to some people who have started wars in his name since the time of the Bible, but he also uses war and the death and misery it creates for his own purposes. It's one of the many reasons why I say that the God of Christianity, in most formulations, is just not a very nice guy. Moving on now to chapter 6. Screwtape expresses his delight that Wormwood's patient is of an age and profession that make military service possible, although it's not probable. We're not sure exactly what age the patient is supposed to be, but apparently he is of an age and profession where it's possible he might be called into service in the military during the war. And Screwtape says, yeah, that's good for us. Screwtape says that they want to encourage the patient to feel maximum uncertainty about his future. He says that suspense and anxiety are the best tools for barricading the mind against the enemy, because the enemy wants people to be concerned with what they do, while demons, such as Screwtape and Wormwood, want people to think more about what's going to happen to them and take their minds off of the practical, immediate matters. Screwtape also warns Wormwood against allowing his patient, who is a newly converted Christian, you'll remember, to view the war as something that must be accepted and withstood with patience and faith that God will provide. Quote, "It is your business to see that the patient never thinks of the present fear as his appointed cross, but only of the things he is afraid of. Let him regard them as his crosses. Let him forget that, since they are incompatible, they cannot all happen to him. And let him try to practice fortitude and patience to them all in advance. for real resignation at the same moment to a dozen different and hypothetical fates is almost impossible, and the enemy does not greatly assist those who are trying to attain it. Resignation to present and actual suffering, even where that suffering consists of fear, is easier and is actually helped by this direct action. So Lewis has been hitting this theme repeatedly, that true Christianity is concerned with the concrete, with the immediate, with the specific. Christians should concern themselves with what's in front of them. Focus on taking action to help others. If you want to stop suffering, identify a specific suffering that is happening right now and do something about that, or pray to God about that. Focus on that. To be concerned with possible futures, to be concerned with abstractions of problems, to worry about things that haven't happened or haven't happened yet, is to be drawn away from God, according to Lewis. And it's actually an interesting tactic from an apologist, and sort of a counterintuitive one, depending on how you look at it, given how large the prospect of hell looms in the Christian worldview. In Lewis's formulation, the best way to avoid hell is apparently to not spend so much time worrying about it. And the best way to deal with present troubles is to focus on them instead of becoming preoccupied with what else could happen. Again, Screwtape reminds Wormwood of the importance of getting the patient to pay attention to his idea of God rather than to God himself. He also tells Wormwood to know when to turn the patient's thoughts outward and when to turn them inward. He recommends a general rule to encourage the patient to be unself-conscious in activities which favor their cause, the demon's cause, such as feeling anger or lust over some person or object, but encourage the patient to focus his attention inward when he begins reflecting on things like how much more devout or charitable he is becoming. In those cases, you want him to focus on those feelings because those, again, according to Lewis's version of Christianity, those are ungodly feelings. It's ungodly for a Christian to focus on how pious they are, to focus on how much more charitable and kind they are becoming. Screwtape also repeats his warning not to think that the war will necessarily do them any favors. Yes, war can encourage hatred of the enemies of one's own nation, but since this hatred is usually abstract and directed against people the patient has never actually met, it can produce disappointing results. The English, Screwtape says, are especially bad in this respect because they will proclaim their hatred of the enemy and then give tea and cigarettes to the first wounded German pilot who turns up at the back door. That's a quote. And again, this is a funny moment to me. The idea of a demon mocking the English for not hating their war adversaries enough and for being too compassionate toward wounded enemy troops is a clever one, and it continues to sketch out Screwtape as a very strong comic character here. Given how badly England had been bombarded by Germany during the Blitz, I wonder how many English people would have been as charitable toward wounded German pilots as Lewis describes. Some, I'm sure, perhaps even many, but I bet there were more than a few who would have made a point of not sharing their tea and cigarettes as well. In fact, that seems like sort of the perfect passive-aggressive British response to an enemy soldier. Oh, sure, we'll help you. We won't let you die. We'll tend to your wounds, but we won't offer you any tea. Screwtape recommends that Wormwood take any anger and hatred stirred in his patient toward the Germans and redirect it toward the people he is surrounded by every day. And likewise, to see that his benevolence is directed far outward, away from people he actually knows. That way, his malice will feel real and close by, and his benevolence will feel imaginary. Why inflame his hatred of Germans, Screwtape asks, if the patient also grows closer to his mother or his employer or people he encounters on the street? Then they haven't gained anything. He tells Wormwood that he can't shut out everything from the enemy, but he can and must relocate the virtues out into the realm of fantasy, so they no longer have any real impact on the patient. The virtues are only fatal to their demonic purposes when they become part of the will and are embodied in the habits. That is what the demons must avoid in the patient. Again and again, Lewis is interested in practical Christianity. Virtues are not just something that you think or feel. Virtues that are not lived are not useful and essentially don't count. As I said about a chapter I reviewed in the previous video, if you take the religion out of this, it's actually pretty good advice. What you think, what you believe, only truly matter when they are translated into what you do, when they escape your head and they manifest in the real world through your actions, through your speech, through something that you do out there, outside of your head. If you claim to hold some lofty virtues, but you never actually act on them, your behavior isn't influenced by them, then what good are they? It's a good point. Moving on to chapter 7. In this chapter, Screwtape is responding to a question from Wormwood about revealing himself to his patient. Wormwood has apparently floated this possibility. What if I reveal myself to the patient and he knows that I'm a demon who is sitting on his shoulder or what have you? And Screwtape explains that it is official policy that they conceal their existence to their patients. Another sort of charming, amusing allusion to the bureaucracy of hell. Well, sorry, we can't reveal ourselves to the patient. It's official policy not to do that. We must remain concealed. Although this has not always been the case, and that accounts for the fact that humans have concepts of demons and devils. We know about these things even if we don't really believe that they're real, because once upon a time, demons and devils used to reveal themselves to people. Screwtape admits that they are in a difficult spot as far as this subject is concerned, because if they reveal their existence to the patients, then they also reveal the existence of the supernatural in general, and it becomes impossible to make them into materialists and skeptics. The best thing to do, he writes, is to mythologize their science so that they will, in effect, believe in demons such as Screwtape and Wormwood without calling them by their true names. They will begin to worship things like life force, or sex, or psychoanalysis, or other things that they will place in the place of God. And this is a common apologist trope as well. Lewis isn't hitting it quite as hard or quite as inelegantly as a lot of other ones would, but the idea of, well, we take other things and we put them in the rightful place of God in our lives. We worship, and they use the word worship very loosely, we worship our work, we worship our egos, we worship our happiness or our pleasure, and we put those things in the center of our lives when actually God should be in that place. And that's sort of what Screwtape is recommending to Wormwood here. We can't let the patient know that we as devils are really here, but we can get them to worship things other than God, and that will be just as good. That will be the next best thing. Screwtape looks forward to the day when they are able to produce what he calls their perfect work, which he names the materialist magician. And that would be someone who worships these poorly defined forces, these vague sort of quasi-supernatural things that aren't actually anything real or specific, but they deny the existence of things like spirits. So they don't believe in angels and demons and gods and devils, but they do believe in these sort of undefinable life forces or spiritual things that aren't actually real. Screwtape assures Wormwood that they have an advantage in that modern humans typically regard devils to be comic figures. Because of this, even if the patient should somehow begin to suspect Wormwood's existence, it will be easy enough to discourage him in this belief because he will naturally view the idea as ridiculous. And Screwtape suggests maybe Wormwood, if this happens, if his patient starts to suspect that he is there, put an idea into his head, put an image into his head of a man dressed in a red devil costume with a tail and a pitchfork, and the patient will naturally laugh at this and think that this is just an absurd notion, that he would think that this creature would really exist, and then he'll forget about it. Screwtape also addresses a question from Wormwood about whether to turn the patient into an extreme patriot or an extreme pacifist. All extremes are to be encouraged, he says, except extreme devotion to God. That is the one exception. Other ages have been more lukewarm and complacent than this present one, and during those ages, extremism was undesirable because it caused people to be more aware of the world around them. But in this modern era, which Screwtape says is unbalanced and prone to faction, all forms of extremism should be inflamed, except for the aforementioned extremism in the cause of God. This factionalism can work to their advantage, even if it leads to people joining the church, Screwtape explains, because even if a group comes together ostensibly to serve God's purpose, if that group remains small and exclusive, this can make its members self-righteous, and that's good for Screwtape and company. While the capital C true church has not been taken over and corrupted with factionalism, there are subordinate factions within it that have produced what Screwtape deems admirable results. Of the two proposed extremes, patriotism and pacifism, Screwtape recommends that Wormwood direct his patient toward pacifism based on what Screwtape knows of the patient's personality. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Screwtape writes, quote, "Whichever he adopts, your main task will be the same. Let him begin by treating the patriotism or the pacifism as a part of his religion. Then let him, under the influence of partisan spirit, come to regard it as the most important part. Then quietly and gradually nurse him on to the stage at which the religion becomes merely a part of the cause. Once you have made the world an end and faith a means, you have almost won your man, and it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing, provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, and crusades matter more to him than prayers and sacraments and charity. He is ours, and the more religious on those terms, the more securely ours." And again, we see this theme of the proper primacy of God in a Christian's life. It's a major theme throughout this chapter. Lewis repeatedly draws his readers back to the immediate, to the active, to the concrete matters of everyday life. But while he does this, he also, in this chapter, reminds them that their actions and their thoughts should ideally be focused on God. God belongs in the center. And yes, you should be focused on the real, the concrete, the immediate, the specific, not the vague and the far away. But it should be with God in the center. Lewis comes back to that again and again and again. And this has been one of the most claustrophobic of all Christian ideas to me in the years I've been studying and responding to apologetics. You find this again and again, that everything must center on God. God must not only be important to you, but the most important thing, the thing that comes before everything else: family, friends, community, work, everything. If you do not live first and foremost for God at all times, then you're not doing it right. Imagine an omnipotent being expecting, nay, demanding this level of devotion. Why would an eternal, all-powerful God demand exclusive loyalty and love like he was some kind of insecure dictator constantly worried that his people were about to overthrow him? God, of course, is immune from Lewis's admonitions against extremism. He has Screwtape recommend every form of extremism to Wormwood except extreme devotion to God. Extremism in the service of God is no vice, perhaps he would say. And also in this chapter, we see again some criticism of the church, or the earthly church, I suppose, as Lewis would insist on defining it. That you can be religious, you can even be affiliated with a church, you can find yourself devoted to your church or to your religious group and still be serving the devil's purpose. This is a point that Lewis brings up again and again, that just calling yourself a Christian or joining a church is not enough. Well, now let's move on to chapter 8, the final chapter we're going to discuss today. Wormwood is apparently hopeful that his patient's religious phase is about to pass. Screwtape, of course, is less optimistic. He reminds Wormwood that humans are amphibians, by which he means that we are half spirit and half animal. And because of this, humans are constantly moving back and forth between the divine and the worldly. So while it may appear to Wormwood that his patient is moving away from his religious devotion, this is probably just a normal part of that ongoing undulation, as Screwtape calls it. And it's not due to Wormwood's own efforts. If he's falling a little bit away from his faith, that's just something that happens. So don't take credit for that and don't get too excited about that, Screwtape is saying. To make the best use of this cycle of peaks and troughs, Screwtape recommends finding out what use God intends to make of it, and then to do the opposite. Quote, Now, it may surprise you to learn that in his efforts being God's efforts, to get permanent possession of a soul, he relies on the troughs even more than on the peaks. One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, not because he has absorbed them, but because their wills freely conform to his. But now you see that the irresistible and the indisputable are the two weapons which the very nature of his scheme forbids him to use. Merely to override a human will would be for him useless. He cannot ravish. He can only woo. How icky is that last line? I know it's a demon saying it, but he's describing the situation accurately, according to Lewis. He's not approving of it, but Lewis is basically putting his own voice in Screwtape's mouth. And the only thing is that Screwtape is shaking his head in disapproval. Isn't it terrible that this is the way it is? But according to Lewis, that is the way that it really is. God wants us to come to him by our own free will so that we unite with him, but we also remain ourselves. That means he can only woo us. He doesn't want to ravish us, another word for rape in this context, because if he forced himself on us in that way, the mere realization of his presence would override our will and we would helplessly be his. But God doesn't want to do it that way. He could. He totally could, but it means more to God if we come to him on our own. That's what God likes. And as we've been told time and time and time again, it's what God likes, and only that matters. Screwtape goes on to remind Wormwood that their efforts are never in more danger of failure than when the patient finds themselves in a trough, spiritually speaking, with no evidence to be found of God's presence, asks why they have been forsaken, but continues to obey God nevertheless. That's another thing that God wants from us, obedience, not just love, not just loyalty, but total, unswerving obedience. But he wants us to want to do it. He won't force us. And it sounds kind of like I'm kink-shaming God, and look, that's not my intention. If God is a dom looking for a sub, good for him. Live your best life. Nothing wrong with that. But that arrangement has to be entered into consensually. The problem is the whole I want you to want this act from God is a sham. If we go by Lewis's version, God won't step in and override our will, but he does impose conditions that I think you'd have to call coercive. Sure, we're free to choose whether or not we submit to God, but the consequence of not choosing to submit to God is eternal damnation. That's not really a free choice, is it? Also, if part of what God wants from us is love, genuine love, you can't really choose that under any circumstances, can you? You can come to love someone, but you can't just choose to love someone like you're throwing a switch. God is essentially saying, I want you to love me, but I want you to love me because you really love me, not because I'm forcing you. Oh, and if you don't love me, I'll light you on fire. But I want it to be your free choice. So go ahead, think about it. Of course, even if you disregard all of that, the power dynamic between humans and God is so unavoidably lopsided that a truly consensual relationship between us and him is impossible. You can't enter into a consensual relationship with someone when they have all the power and you have no power. That's just not the way it works. The excuse that God doesn't reveal himself more obviously because he doesn't want his irresistible presence to override our will, because he wants our relationship with him to be free and consensual, is bullshit. God is the one with all the power, God is the one dictating the terms, and God is the one demanding that obeying him and meeting his needs be our one and only concern. There's no such thing as consent in such an arrangement. Screwtape assures Wormwood at the end of this letter that even though God uses the troughs for his own purposes, the troughs can be put to use for their demonic ends as well. And he promises to give Wormwood some hints on how to do that in his next letter. Ooh, to be continued. There's a hook for you. Drop a little hook in there at the end to make you come back for more. So that's the end of this video. I will be back in the next video to cover the next 4 chapters of the Screwtape letters, chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. I hope you got something out of this one. If you have something to say in response to something I have had to say in this video, please leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. If you are a fellow atheist, if you are a Christian, if you are some other category of believer or non-believer and you have some response, something to say in reaction to what I have had to say, please share it with me in the comment section. Also, please like this video, share it, subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already, and please, please, please consider helping me to continue producing videos on this channel by becoming a supporter of mine through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/SteveShives to become a patron. You can pledge as little as $1 a month, and believe me, those $1 a month pledges help out a ton. If you can afford to pledge $5 a month or higher, then you can take advantage of some extra little perks in the campaign, including getting a sneak peek at scripts for these videos the day before they go public on YouTube. So just something to consider. I appreciate all the help from all of you in whatever form it takes, all of the support, whether it's patronage or just viewership and sharing the videos and commenting and things like that. I couldn't do it without all of you, and I appreciate all the many various kinds of support that you give me. I thank you so much for watching this one, and I will see you next time.